paper that I want to give this morning, this afternoon rather, is something that's come out of some work that I've been doing recently on French philosopher of technology called Bernard Stiegler. The paper itself is The Politics of Stupidity, Reflection and Desire in Stiegler's Critique of the Information Economy. I think the best thing to do is perhaps preface the paper with a few remarks about what exactly the information economy is from Stiegler's perspective. One of the things that comes out of his later work on the evolution of industrial democracies is the idea that there's a convergence between information technologies and what we might call virtual aesthetic technologies. There's an idea that the way in which the world is staged by what Adorno called culture industries, that is the way it is configured through aesthetic media like film, is increasingly informed by an idea that these media of representation are based upon a calculation of the kind of responses they can elicit from us, the kind of responses they can elicit from the masses, which will induce a kind of performativity. One of the things that he's interested in is looking at the way in which aesthetic representation and information technologies come together to form a system in which performativity is constantly encouraged and expanded amongst human beings. And that, of course, is something which is very close to what is the central idea of his philosophy, which is the idea of originary technicity, the notion that human beings are fated to exist within a system of technological supplementation. That what we are is originally technological beings in the sense that we have never been in a state of nature, that consciousness is in some sense always co-present with and co-eval with its technological supplementations. From the most primitive things like sharp-edged flint tools, all the way up to the kind of mnemonic technologies that supplement our understanding of time and that supplement our understanding of the way in which the world is organised around us. All right, so in essence what I want to do is to use this paper as an exposition of his idea, of Stiegler's idea of originary technicity. I also want to explore something which is perhaps the core of his later works on democracy and the fate of democracy, and that is the idea of a politics of stupidity. His idea is, or the concept that he tries to put forward is that the media saturation that has been enabled by new media technologies has now become so pervasive that it kind of wires us into a system of stimulus and response that has more or less killed what he calls noesis, an idea of moral reflection on the world around us. The idea is that these systems of virtual representation provide us with a kind of spontaneous history which doesn't encourage us to reflect, but actually just kind of situates us in spontaneous history which is generated by them. A history which has its own sense of historical time, and a history which doesn't promote any kind of critical reflection. So the paper itself then is in four parts. The first part is a brief consideration of Stiegler's work on the relationship between virtual and information technologies and the process of capitalization. All right, so I mean, one of the things about Stiegler's work is that he is interested in the Frankfurt School. He is interested in the kind of linkage between rationalization, technology, and capitalization that's presented in Adorno's work. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Secondly, I want to set up a clarification of Stiegler's work on the relationship between contemporary culture industries and the politics of stupidity. All right? He has a particular notion of what stupidity is and what the politics of stupidity is. And I'll say a little bit about that. I want to make some remarks on the relationship between political economy of spirit that Stiegler develops in his later work and the manifesto of the organisation which he started called Ars Industrialis, or Industrial Art, and what the function of art is, what the kind of political, provocative function of art is in industrial societies. So I just want to say a little bit about that. I want to finish off by looking at some consideration of what the provocation of art is in industrial societies, what it can actually do to perform a political function. One of the great themes of his work is that what has been induced in modern society is a crisis of sensibility. One of the things that constitutes a republic is a kind of affective feeling engagement of individuals with their community. Part of the republic, the idea of a citizenry in a republic, is this idea of an informed, intelligent sensibility, which for him, the culture industries have gone along, or programming industries have gone a long way to destroying. And so I want to say a little bit about the relationship between art and the attempt to kind of revitalise that sensibility. Okay, so let's kick off then by looking at saying a little bit about Stiegler's relationship to Marx and his attempt to reconstitute a critique of political economy. There's a little book that he wrote in 2010, which he called For a New Critique of Political Economy. And in a sense, what the book is an attempt to revitalise and reconstitute Marx's critique of political economy, but to do it in a very particular way. And I'll just briefly make some remarks on what that is. The essence of of capitalism for for Marx, is what he called the MCM relationship. What he called the MCM relationship. So the money, commodity, money relationship. So that money is invested in commodities which are produced in order to make profit. That is more money. An important thing for Stiegler is that the production of commodities comes through a particular kind of technology in Marx. And the particular kind of technology that Marx talks about are heavy industrial technologies. All right? And what Stiegler wants to say about Marx and Marx's construction of the MCM relationship is that actually he's right, or he would be right, about the historical fate of capitalism if the production of commodities were always to be tied to heavy industrial production. So, if it was the case that machines did not evolve, and if it was the case that all we have were machines that were these kind of heavy industrialized machines that are simply about increasing the speed at which commodities are produced, then the crises of overproduction and underconsumption, which he predicted, would actually mark the death knell of capitalism. But what Stiegler's point is that this crisis of overproduction and underconsumption doesn't come about because technology evolves. And it evolves into things like media technologies, like film, TV, etc. All right? It evolves into technologies which transform the idea of capitalization. They transform the idea of what constitutes a commodity. Now, obviously, the precursor, or the first attempts to kind of quantify this technological transformation of the MCM relationship, comes in the form of the Frankfurt School. And what's interesting about Stiegler is that he's actively engaged with the Frankfurt School critique of capitalism, in the sense that he sees Adorno's culture industry thesis as anticipating this kind of crisis of culture that we talked about at the start of the talk. What we get with the Frankfurt School is this idea of a bewitching of desire by film and television, the kind of stereotypical icons that we seek to live up to, the way in which our imagination becomes bewitched by the culture industry, and which is cashed out in these forms of consumption that we compulsively pursue in large-scale mass capitalist societies. Now what Stiegler wants to say is that this first consumerist solution to the crisis of overproduction and underconsumption is something which is made much worse by its negative effects. Its effects of compulsive attachment to consumption are made worse by the kind of technologies that have evolved in the last 20 or 30 years. The fact that things like virtual reality systems, the fact that instantaneous communication, social networking sites, etc., keep us permanently networked or hardwired into these kind of systems is something that means that this kind of compulsive attachment to consumption is something that is much, much worse than even Adorno could have envisaged. Now, to come back to the kind of originary technicity thesis, there's a synonym for it which he calls organology. He suggests the relationship between technology and human beings is organological in the sense that the two evolve together, they evolve with each other. One entails the other. But the idea is that what happens with these kind of new technologies that hardwire us into the system of performative consumption is that this organological relationships become skewed. The idea is that there is almost no reflection, that the relationship between technology and human beings is one of hard wiring. And the way in which he understands this is through this concept of object attachment. The idea of object attachment, which is something he takes from Freud. The idea is that the id, the unconscious, is something that functions at a level which is unreflective and instinctual. He calls this the drive level. It is without moderation or mediation. And what Stiegler wants to suggest is that the relationship between consumption and desire that is established within these kind of media technologies is one of the object relationship. So the notion is it is now. I have to have this now. The image systems that we have hardwire us into this performative consumption in a way that is without reflection. And so this is a crisis of culture. For him, it is something which is the opposite of noesis. It is the opposite of reflection. It is the opposite of spirit. The consumerist solution that has come about through these kind of technologies is one which has induced a massive crisis of culture. And the place of this crisis is Western industrial democracies. Now, this brings us on to the second part of the paper, which, having looked at Stiegler's analysis of the fate of culture and the fate of democracy, once these kind of virtual informatic systems have become completely pervasive, is to ask the question, okay, what is the politics of stupidity? What are the consequences of, the political consequences of this collapse? What are the political consequences of this emergence, of this kind of powerful object attachment that is without noesis or reflection or spirit? Okay, so let's have a look then at what he calls the politics of stupidity. Let's have a look at the main kind of aspects or characteristics of it. Well, the first thing to say is that it is characterized by this kind of object attachment. The background to it are these kind of object attachments. The background to this politics of stupidity is the collapse of the public sphere, is the degradation of the life work, is the degradation of spiritual attachment. And in a sense, we can see that one of the profound influences on Stiegler's work is Aristotle. He has this Aristotelian idea that human dignity depends upon a certain level of reflection and noesis that takes place within the culture of the state. So the background to this politics of stupidity is this degradation of free, reflexive culture. It is a kind of critical inheritance of the art philosophy, literature, etc., that is passed down generationally to us. It is the loss of the symbolic. It is the loss of the symbolic order of social life. So that for Stiegler there are certain ideal objects to which a certain level of respect is owed. So that's the idea of the republic, the idea of the state, the idea of the law. The notion is that the law, for example, is not something that is entirely coercive. We are obedient to the law because we see it as embodying certain rational principles that we ought to adhere to. So the law, as an ideal form, presupposes some concept of rational attachment by the citizenry. However, what we get in these kind of societies that are based on these object attachments is the loss of this symbolic attachment. Reflection tends to be completely excluded. And what he wants to suggest is that this lack of symbolic attachment, this lack of affective engagement in the cultural and symbolic life of society, is something which is utterly intolerable. He wrote a book, one of his latest books is called What Makes Life Worth Living? And it's a description of the kind of fundamental satisfactions of living in the symbolic life of society. These symbolic satisfactions are what, as human beings, make us happy, because they are not about fleeting object attachments, they are about commitment to and reflection upon things like the republic, the law, the ethical tradition in which we live. And where our lives become completely dominated by these kind of object attachments, which is all now, move on to the next object attachment to which your libido is attracted, is that they are utterly unsatisfied. And he sees this kind of Western malaise as something which has to be addressed because it is the exhaustion of humanity. A society which is based upon this constant and expanded performativity is something which exhausts humanity and becomes utterly unendurable. It is the destruction of the libidinal attachment that human beings have to their communities. Now, what he wants to suggest is that there are two elements to this politics of stupidity. The first one is a particular state politics which arises when the state becomes entirely hollowed out. The idea is that under neoliberal conditions, the state is no longer really an object of moral guidance. It becomes something which is there just to make the running of the economy more and more efficient. And what he wants to suggest is that, in general, the politics of these kind of neoliberal industrial states is one of a radical appeal to traditional values. The notion is because there is very little libidinal or affective engagement with the social institutions which govern us, the idea is that the state simply is a system which is there to discipline us. It is the hard conservative imposition of the law which, when people deviate from the norms of performativity, is imposed upon us. So it tends to be a politics of extremely traditional values which clamp down on any kind of deviance which would interrupt the smooth running of the system. However, there is also another politics of stupidity which operates at a cosmopolitan level, and the idea is that this politics of stupidity takes place between what has become known as the clash of civilizations between East and West. On one side, this politics of stupidity is a politics of extreme opposition to those forces which are seen as threatening Western democracy and Western civilization. So you get the kind of extreme reactions to fundamentalisms which are presented as a threat to the established order of Western civilization. But on the other hand, these politics, the extremity of fundamentalisms, are also seen as part of this play of political stupidities, whereby you get this kind of radical commitment to the establishment of an orthodoxy which cannot accept any kind of deviation itself. So you get this play of a cosmopolitical situation in which neither side is ever able to approach each other through any kind of gesture of hospitality. Okay, so what we've got then is the emergence of a politics of stupidity that arises from this kind of idea of a Western malaise. So the question then emerges, what possibility is there for some kind of emergence from this cycle of object attachments, this cycle of universal and constantly expanded performativity, this cycle of disindividuation, and this cycle of chronic unhappiness? Well, he wants to make some suggestions that we can see the emergence of a new politics of spirit. And part of that new politics of spirit is an idea of art and artistic creativity. The first thing that we need to bear in mind is the fact that for Stiegler, technology is not something which is, despite the impression that you can get sometimes from his later works, it is not something that simply brings about this hard wiring of human beings into a system that exploits them in a way that robs them of any capacity for self-expression. What he wants to say is that technology is, and this is another one of his central terms, a pharmakon. And it's a word he takes from Plato. It means the pharmakon is something which has a dual effect. It is the sickness and the remedy. It is the illness and the cure. And that's what he says about technology. Technologies are not just about hardwiring us into a system which exhausts our libidinal energy. It also offers new opportunities for new acts of self-expression. This technological organisation of society brings with it, at the same time as it damages us, a new libidinal economy. Now, what does this look like? Well, what he wants to say is that essentially the experience that we have in this kind of Western model of constant provocation of performativity is something that is wounding. All right? He talks, there is a section in the second volume of Disbelief and Discontent, that's the books on democracy, where he says the wound that we receive from living in these systems, the damage which they do to us, is the precipitation of an acting out of new forms of aesthetic activity which express the damage that is done to us within these systems of prosthetic connection, which constantly provoke more and more performativity. So artistic expression is something that is necessitated by the kind of damage that is done to us within these systems. We are not insentient beings. Using us as units of energy gives rise to a libidinal economy which allows, or which demands, some kind of expression, some free self-expression, which acts as a kind of provocation to others. It is the possibility, once more, of noesis. Spirit, noesis, and the aesthetic haunt these systems. And the systems which condemn us to this life of performativity also, at the same time as, allow new forms of expression, new forms of aesthetic creativity. And so, one of the interesting things about Stiegler's thesis is that it's not one-dimensional. You know, it's not technology is good, it's the future of democracy, or technology is bad, it's just a new form of the culture industry. It's both at the same time. All right, so we've got this idea that it opens up the possibility of new forms of noetic and aesthetic activity that offer a gesture of self-expression that is a guidance to others, that is a spark, a possibility, an event that allows some kind of reaction and response that is noetic, or an expression of spirit. It's these kind of Nietzschean moments, these moments of expression which spark off of others and whose gesture is essentially cosmo-political, cross-border, which allows moments of communication between cultures that the kind of politics of stupidity doesn't allow. It's this which is provoked by, it's this provocation that is the object of the political movement that he has started, the political cultural movement, ars industrialis, or industrial art. The political manifesto they have is a manifesto which is about provoking this kind of activity within this kind of reified, highly performative society. And really what this provocation is, it's about a provocation of spirit. What he means by spirit is not some nebulous idea, some nebulous idealistic conception. What he means by spirit is the necessity of acting in ways of acts of self-expression that are provoked by the fact of our living within these systems and the intolerability of it that is experienced through this kind of constant provocation to capitalization and performance. Okay, so by way of a conclusion, I just want to say a couple of things about what kinds of things this kind of artistic creativity would do, what it would look like. Obviously, it wouldn't be part of the kind of erratic tradition that Benjamin talks about in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. It wouldn't be a return to traditional painting. It wouldn't be a return to traditional forms of artistic expression. It takes place through and within the systems of informatic communication and virtual reality that have become the environment that we as human beings inhabit. But one of the things that perhaps it does connect him to Walter Benjamin is the idea that the technologies through which this acting out can take place allow us to produce new forms of art and new atomization of our experience, new ways of expressing the sense of exhaustion, dislocation and disindividuation that has happened to us. These new technologies, the eidetic image, the way in which the image can be reproduced and disseminated, allow for the possibility of new forms of art that are cosmopolitical, that do cross borders, and that do open up possibilities of, and this is another word that he uses in conjunction with spirit, poiesis. The meeting of cultures is something, and the possibility of hospitality is not something that is in a sense reducible to contractual ideas, it's poetic. It's an idea that it is provoked through artistic creativity. It is a possibility that is always there but remains to be realized. And so the cosmopolitical gesture of art is something which is poetical and almost beyond kind of contractual expression. Another element within this kind of artistic creativity is poiesis. Sorry, not poiesis, is the use of obscenity and parody. One of the things, and this is a kind of interesting idea that he puts forward, one of the things, the horizon of a techno-scientific organization of society, especially through biotechnologies, is the horizon of a life that would continue forever, the immortality of the body, an eternally youthful, beautiful human being that is not subject to the forces of nature. Well, for Stiegler, the idea of an organological relationship between humanity and technology is one that says that is an impossibility. We cannot become immortals and remain what we are as human beings. And so this whole pursuit of eternal life, eternal youth and eternal beauty is something which is ridiculous. It's something which is absurd. It's something which is a degradation and mutilation of what we are as human beings. And so this kind of ars industrialis is about showing the ridiculousness, the stupidity of this kind of collective madness about the immortality of human beings and eternal beauty. And finally, and I'll leave you with this, the other word that lies close to his idea of spirit is the concept of otium. And otium is the labour of spirit. Otium is something which is done because it is an essentially satisfying form of activity. It's reflection that in this kind of Aristotelian way is an end in itself and a higher pleasure. And it's something that for Stiegler will save us. And it will save us because it leads us to reflect. It leads us into forms of activity that aren't performative, obsessively and exhaustingly performative, in the sense that he puts forward when he discusses what has happened in Western societies which have become subject to this informatic provocation of capitalization. All right? So otium is something that we as human beings should engage in. Work that is not about capitalization. And if you look at some of the pronouncements that he makes online, there are a number of things that on YouTube that he's talked about. One of the things that he talks about is a massive investment in culture. Because for him, it is that which leads to this kind of spiritual regeneration, this aesthetic regeneration that he talks about. All right, that's it.
I'm Wei from School of Business. Please forgive me if I misunderstand something you were talking about. I have two questions. First is about the organology between of the idea in the context of finance, for example. If I interpret it well, I guess the technology added value to the finance has also harmed finance because of the like hyper frequency transition in the stock market. I understand at the same time the technology added value to the finance sector, which could be interpreted as fintech in the global context. And the second is about pharmacology, which you mentioned about. And I'm thinking about the political perspective. If one understood well in the previous question that technology added value to the finance, but also did harm to this sector, what is political responses on that? For example, you mentioned about the politics of stupidity. What's the interpretation of that in the financial innovation from this theory?
Right. Okay. I'm maybe misinterpreting your question here, but I know one of the kind of indications that he talks about is the notion that innovation is not always about kind of positive invention. Is it that that one of the things that contributes to this kind of idea of obsessive consumerism are the slight changes that are made to things like iPods, iPads, mobile phones, that these things are slightly tweaked, and it's this that passes for innovation because it generates a lot of capital very quickly in that market sector. But actually, that's not really a kind of particularly beneficial way of getting technological innovation. They're perhaps, it would be more beneficial for us as a species if it happened in other sectors. I don't know if I may have misinterpreted your question.
I need your interpretation on the theory, so it's fine that we
Yeah, so it would be from an organological perspective, I think the idea would be that for him, that kind of superficial innovation would be something that would be part of that kind of performative culture industry provocation. So, yeah, I think that's how we would understand it.
Okay.
Yes.
My name is Abu. I'm a teacher and a researcher. Very interesting talk. I have, I think, 3 points. The first point is that you talk about a clash of civilizations at the moment. Seems to be, in my point of view, Western civilization against Islam full-blown. And the other point is, within this context of this war on civilization, war between clash of civilizations, there's also, with technology, the surveillance, more and more intruding into our daily lives, the surveillance of communities, the fifth Muslims seen as the fifth column, And also, I'm involved in the Stop War Coalition, and coincidentally, I attended a meeting yesterday, an event yesterday, and it was about drone warfare and how drones are now, used basically to kill people. Most of the people that are killed by drones, NATO drones, are civilians.
Absolutely.
And they've been used to spy on us as well.
I think one of the things I want to write about actually is about the emergence of drone technology and the way that transforms global politics. Because I think there's a transformation of geopolitics that goes on with drones, and what it does is to normalise war, is to normalise violence, because it's no risk to you. You can use these kind of things as a substitute for political negotiation. And I think stuff like that idea of killing the other without any kind of responsibility or ethical sense of obligation to them, I think that's something that comes out of Stiegler's work. And that's something that I want to write about. I think it's very important, the way geopolitics get transformed. It's no longer negotiation, it's like surgical strikes to keep people in there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that'd be a really interesting thing to look at.
And the surveillance? Yeah,
the surveillance thing, again, it's one of the things that comes out of that is, again, one of the things that I talked about is this kind of reactionary politics of the state, where it becomes hollowed out and ceases to be a real object of kind of ethical commitment. It has reversion to something which is police actions, and that's done through, again, this kind of universal kind of surveillance and the identification of people who are trouble in inverted commas. So yeah.
Thank
you. Yes.
I was hoping you could sort of clear something up for me with regards to Stiegler's interpretation of reflection in this new order, this new economy of ideas exchange, really. Your focus seems to be on aesthetics, and in particular on sort of, you referred to atomism in particular.
Yeah.
Does he account for ideas exchange and reflection in the sort of transindividuated setting, which I know he refers to it as something which is absent, but in my reading that I've looked over, I get the impression that he doesn't foresee something which moves back to that old order of individuation meets transindividuation and that kind of constant dialectic. Does he see that coming back, or are we sort of looking from his point of view at this constant atomism?
Yeah, I mean, well, the two bits of the question. I mean, firstly, there's the stuff about culture. I mean, I've concentrated on the aesthetic because that's something I was interested in at the time. But when he talks about culture, he means philosophy, he means art, he means poetry, he means literature, he means everything.
Okay.
So, and that, that's what this idea of Otium refers to. It's every kind of cultural engagement. But one of the things that he does say, and one of the things that links him to Adorno, is that that idea that capitalism is potentially immortal. And he says any kind of radical change to that is way beyond our time frame. Right. The best we can hope for is the preservation of a tendency, and that tendency is that there is technological appropriation of human beings, but also resistance to it, and that's the best we can get. He says in some kind of very distant future, things may change radically, maybe a different kind of economy, because we can't foresee that. But for him, at the moment, that's the horizon. It's preserving a tendency. It's preserving the kind of dialectical exchange between technological system and noetic culture. Right, that's what he said. Yeah. Yes.
Well, okay, so I've got a few just sort of general questions that I think all are connected, and that's to do with so firstly, Stiegler's notion of bêtise or stupidity, it seems very much along the lines of half education in Adorno's theories, and I was also wondering whether the sort of cosmopolitical gesture is really about a way to individuate us within a larger collective, using the already there, or
Yeah.
but isn't that a lot like Leibniz in Benjamin, as
Yes.
opposed to Farfram?
Absolutely.
And,
yeah.
And so I was wondering whether, in this attempt to transcend a kind of means-end distinction, whether he's implicitly invoking a kind of a mimetic comportment towards the object that we individuate with. But I mean that in a very abstract way. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that raises the question of the symbolic in his work, and the idea is that if you wanted to take him to task on what the significance of this idea of noetic identification is, you could suggest that it is too Aristotelian. You know, it's this idea of kind of engagement with symbolic, idealised objects, and that perhaps that might not be something that was realisable within these kind of technological systems, that the two might not be directly compatible with each other. But, on the other hand, I think what you could say that perhaps for him that is something that exists as a horizon, this idea of, you know, the concept or the notion of the republic, the concept or the notion of the law, are things that are there for us and sustained as a kind of collective memory and to which we have a responsibility. And for him, it's that which sustains this kind of tension, again, between technological performativity and noetic culture and activity. And that's, you know, that for him is the provocation to what he calls Otium.
I forgot to say as well, is his aesthetic gesture largely really an attempt to give a voice to suffering, as Adorno says in Negative Dialectics?
Yeah, there's a big section in one of the volumes, I can't remember which one it is, where he talks about the wound. There's a First World War veteran who comes back from the war with some absolutely appalling injury, and after he comes back, he writes, and in his biography he says, "I write from my wound." The wound is the thing that provokes him to write. And for him, for Stiegler, what the place we live now, in this kind of overwrought provocation to performativity, is the wound for all of us. And so for him, this massive investment in culture is the thing that provides us with some medium to be able to express the wound, if you like.
Isn't that just another articulation of the damaged life, though, of minimum moralia?
Yeah, yeah. But I think the response he would say is that damage is something which is rooted in the fate of human beings always to live within these kind of technological systems. And that's at the basis of this new kind of libidinal economy that emerges. The idea is that the suffering, the idea that the articulation of the wound always comes with the possibility of, firstly, resisting that kind of performativity, and secondly, through the practice of Otium, having some responsibility to the idea of the law, the idea of a republic, the idea of a kind of cosmopolitan justice. So these things are transcendent, or they're ideals, but their ideality comes from our fate to live within these systems. So, yeah, it is damaged life, but it's damaged life that isn't, I guess he would argue, is
It's not part of a negative totality, basically.
Exactly, that's
Yeah,
right.
okay.
That's exactly right, yeah. Yes.
So this aesthetic response,
Yes.
does it engage with the state in an effort to arrest the hollowing out and reverse it, or does it seek to work totally outside it?
I think for him, the idea of the republic has to be something that's engaged with what's there now. I think for him, it would be something that has to have some kind of institutional base, and I think ars industrialis is something that is set out to influence policy. I mean, for example, he actually one of the manifesto commitments is free software and free computer access for everybody, so that everyone is given some kind of means to express themselves. So yeah, it is. He does see it as being a kind of